we celebrate your courage, high standards in nonprofit leadership, and commitment to mentoring hundreds of others across more than 5 decades of advocacy. So, thank you, Lois.
My name is Lois Carson. I live in San Bernardino, and I first met George Brown during his very first campaign. A song comes to mind when I think of George. You may have heard it. What a man, what a man, what a man, what a mighty good man. That was George Brown. He cared about all kinds of people, but I'd like to just address the fact that he was concerned about women and minorities getting a fair share of the promise of America. And he appointed me to his military advisory committee, and for the very reason that he wanted us to go out and find good minority candidates and female candidates to go to the service academies. And I'm proud to say that we sent the first female who was accepted at the Naval Academy from the Rialto Unified School District. Many young people. There's a young African American who's an admiral today in the Navy, who was one of the candidates that George sent to the service academies. And because of what I learned about the academies and all of that, when my own grandson was invited to consider that, I was able to help him understand the benefits of a service academy, and he is now at the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs, Colorado. But George was not a by-the-book person. He was willing to listen to other ways of doing things to get objectives achieved. And it just makes me happy to know that I met such a person as George and learned a lot from him. And I'm glad to be a part of this project to bring his archives to the university.
I'm pleased to present this to Sam on behalf of the George Brown Legacy Project in recognition of extraordinary public service that carries on the mission of Congressman George Brown, focused on public interest, rooted in the diverse communities of the inland region, and advancing equal justice and excellence in public education at all levels to achieve a more interconnected world.
George Brown set the standard for all elected officials. What he did in Congress, very few congressmen have done since then. I first met George in the early 60s. I ran a campaign with him, not for him. He was running for Congress. And he set the example of how to run a campaign and how to be a politician. And without George, I think the entire Congress would suffer.
My name is Jane Block, and once living in Riverside, I became active in the feminist movement and gave speeches in the area about feminism. At that same time, there was the energy and effort to create the place for George Brown in our community, and it brought a whole important component. When you have a problem or a disagreement, rather than confrontation, one looks for compromise, and I adopted that as I started to reach out to the community in many different ways.
My name is Michael Dunn. I'm an academic, and I was a new assistant professor, associate professor at the University of California in Riverside. There are several aspects of George Brown's tenure in politics that were very important to us. One, of course, was his opposition to the military actions supported by the United States in El Salvador and Nicaragua especially, and also in Guatemala. So the sanctuary movement was a way to educate the American people about what was going on. The point of the sanctuary movement was to educate people here in the United States about the plight of refugees coming from Central America, that in fact they were qualified as political refugees, the kinds of protections afforded other refugees in other war fronts. And that wasn't happening. George Brown was a scientist himself. He had been trained in physics, and that was of great benefit to academics like myself, a biochemist who needed funding from groups, well, from programs like the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health. And he played a very important role in advocating for the support of science on university campuses across the nation.
I'm Kathy Kinley, and I had the privilege of working on George congressional campaigns in both 82 and 84. But the really special thing I remember about George is when I was a school administrator at Danza Middle School in the heart of the barrio of Ontario, and George came and met with my students. We talked to him about his love of science. They, of course, never experienced that they would ever meet a living member of the Congress, and that was probably my most special thing, is just having him be there as a seated member of the United States Congress, just talking to the kids about his love of science, of his interest in space exploration, and they talked about it years afterwards because he was such an incredible human being for them to meet, and many of them went on and pursued science in high school largely because of George's passion, and I will always be grateful to him for that.